The mist clung to the ancient oaks like a shroud, weaving through the skeletal branches that clawed at the dimming sky. It was Christmas Eve at Monticello, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but beneath the veneer of holiday quiet lay a restlessness that stirred the soul. Eleanor had come here not for merriment, but for whispers of the past, tales buried in the archives of how the enslaved had celebrated amid the grandeur of Thomas Jefferson's domain. The plantation house loomed in the distance, its windows aglow with false warmth, while the woods beyond beckoned with an insidious pull, their depths swallowing the last rays of twilight. She wandered the narrow path, her boots crunching over frost-kissed leaves, drawn by an old map she'd unearthed in the library, one that marked forgotten trails where shadows danced unchecked. The wind sighed through the trees, carrying fragments of sound, low, murmuring voices that seemed to rise from the ground itself, indistinct yet insistent, like echoes of forgotten laments. At first, she thought it a trick of the evening, the isolation playing upon her nerves, but as she pressed deeper, the whispers sharpened, weaving words she could almost grasp. Freedom, tonight, the signal. A chill seeped into her bones, not from the cold alone, but from the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The woods held secrets, she knew, stories of Yuletide respites granted by the master, brief illusions of joy where families gathered in hidden clearings, sharing scraps of food and stolen songs under the cover of night. Yet the archives hinted at something darker, disappearances veiled as accidents, punishments cloaked in festive guise, and a mystery that had silenced generations. The voices grew nearer, pulling her toward a thicket where the trees twisted like tormented souls, and in that moment, Eleanor felt the veil between past and present thin, as if the very ground hungered to reveal what had long been entombed in silence. The frost-laden air of Christmas Eve hung heavy over Monticello, a deceptive stillness that masked the restless spirits stirring beneath the soil. Eleanor Hayes, a 34-year-old historian specializing in the hidden narratives of American slavery, had driven through the night from Washington, D.C., her car packed with archival notes, digital scans of Jefferson's farm books, and a dog-eared copy of Lucia Stanton's groundbreaking work on the enslaved community at the plantation. 4 years, she had pored over ledgers that recorded the lives of hundreds of men, women, and children in cold, transactional detail, names listed beside barrels of corn, yards of Osnaburg cloth, and the occasional notation of a holiday ration. But something in those entries had always gnawed at her, the terse mentions of runaways who vanished during the brief Yuletide respite, their absences noted almost casually between inventories of hogs slaughtered for the great house table. This Christmas Eve felt different. A dense fog had rolled in from the Rivanna River, swallowing the rolling Piedmont hills and turning the familiar drive up the mountain into a slow, disorienting crawl. As her headlights cut through the murk, the iconic dome of Monticello emerged like a pale ghost against the darkened sky, its brick walls glowing faintly from the lights within. Tourists had long since departed, the site was closed for the holidays, leaving only a skeleton staff in the visitor center far below. Eleanor had secured special permission to stay overnight in one of the staff cottages, ostensibly to examine newly processed documents in the research library. Yet her true purpose lay elsewhere. In the months prior, while cross-referencing Jefferson's correspondence with overseer reports, she had stumbled upon fragmented references to unexplained disappearances among the enslaved population specifically during the Christmas season. A 1799 entry noted that 2 men from the Mulberry Row quarters failed to return after the customary holiday pass. Another from 1805 recorded the loss of a skilled blacksmith who had been allowed extra rations and a day's rest. No further details followed, no recovery, no punishment recorded, no mention of reward posters. The absences simply dissolved into silence, as though the mountain itself had absorbed them. Eleanor parked near the service entrance, the gravel crunching sharply under her tires in the otherwise muffled quiet. She pulled her coat tighter against the damp chill and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The great house stood illuminated for the seasonal decorations, its windows spilling warm golden light onto the terraced gardens, an image crafted to evoke genteel Virginian hospitality. But her gaze drifted past the manicured lawns toward the dark line of woods that bordered the plantation's western edge. Somewhere within those tangled oaks and cedars, she believed, lay the unspoken truth of those vanished souls, a truth tied to the cruel irony of a holiday celebration that offered just enough hope to become the perfect law. The fog pressed closer, carrying the faint, metallic scent of impending snow, and as she shouldered her bag and began walking toward the tree line, an inexplicable pull urged her forward, as though the woods themselves were waiting to confess what the polished narratives of history had long concealed. The path narrowed as Eleanor pushed deeper into the woods, the fog thickening until the distant lights of Monticello vanished entirely, leaving only the pale beam of her flashlight slicing through the gloom. Bare branches arched overhead like the ribs of some ancient beast, dripping with moisture that pattered softly onto the carpet of dead leaves below. The air grew heavier, laced with the sharp tang of wet bark and decaying undergrowth, and every footfall seemed muffled, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. She had intended to follow the old service trail marked on her map, a faint line that once connected the Mulberry Row cabins to the charcoal pits and distant fields. But the fog disoriented her sense of direction, turning familiar landmarks into indistinct shapes that loomed and retreated like phantoms. She paused beneath a massive oak, its trunk scarred by centuries of storms, and consulted her compass only to find the needle trembling erratically, refusing to settle. A faint unease prickled at the back of her neck, the kind that comes not from rational fear but from the primal awareness of being watched. Then it began, a sound so subtle she almost dismissed it as the wind threading through the branches. A low murmur, rising and falling in cadence, too rhythmic to be natural. She froze, flashlight sweeping in slow arcs, illuminating nothing but twisted trunks and drifting mist. Yet the sound persisted, growing clearer with each passing second. Voices, fragmented and distant, carried on the damp air like threads of smoke. They were not loud, these whispers, but intimate, as though spoken just beyond the edge of hearing, a woman's soft humming, broken by a child's muffled sob, a man's deeper tone murmuring words she could not quite catch, something about wait for the signal and past the river bend. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She told herself it was an acoustic trick, perhaps echoes from the staff cottages far below, or teenagers sneaking onto the grounds for a holiday thrill. But the voices bore no trace of modern inflection, no laughter, no casual slang, only a weary, haunting quality that seemed to seep from the earth itself. They wove together in snatches of melody, a spiritual she recognized from oral histories collected decades ago, its lyrics altered into something secretive and urgent. The tune twisted through the trees, now closer, now retreating, drawing her forward against her better judgment. She stepped off the path, drawn toward the source, the beam of her light catching on low-hanging vines that brushed against her coat like cold fingers. The whispers intensified, layering over one another in a chorus too ethereal to be flesh and blood, pleas for silence, warnings of patrols, fragmented prayers offered beneath the cover of darkness. The forest seemed to pulse with them, the mist swirling in slow eddies as if stirred by unseen breath. For the first time since arriving at Monticello, Eleanor felt the full weight of the land's buried grief pressing upon her, those voices rising not from imagination but from the soil where countless footsteps had once trod in desperate search of fleeting respite during a season meant for joy. The whispers clung to Eleanor like damp cobwebs as she pressed onward, her flashlight beam trembling slightly in her grip. The voices ebbed and flowed, retreating into the rustle of leaves only to surge again with renewed urgency, pulling her deeper into the labyrinth of trunks and shadows. She tried to anchor herself with logic. Sound carries strangely in fog, especially in these hollows carved by centuries of wind and water, but the rational explanations felt thin, brittle against the insistent pull of the murmurs. Her boot caught on something half buried beneath a tangle of roots, sending her stumbling forward. She steadied herself against the rough bark of a gnarled oak, its trunk wider than she could span with both arms, scarred by old axe marks and the slow creep of lichen. Kneeling, she swept aside the mat of sodden leaves and frost-rimed earth, revealing a flat, weathered stone that seemed deliberately placed. Beneath it, wrapped in rotted oilcloth that disintegrated at her touch, lay a small leather-bound journal no larger than her palm, its pages warped and darkened by time and moisture. With careful fingers, she eased it open. The ink had bled in places, but the handwriting remained legible, tight, deliberate strokes of a man who had learned letters in secret. The first entry was dated December 24, 1808, and bore the name Elias Wormley in a proud, uneven script. Eleanor's breath caught. She knew that name from the Monticello rolls, an enslaved blacksmith who had worked the forge on Mulberry Row, valued for his skill with iron yet noted only in passing for his disappearance years later. The pages chronicled the cruel theater of Christmas at the plantation, the extra ration of molasses and salt pork doled out with fanfare, the permission granted for families to gather after evening chores, the fiddler brought in to play reels while overseers watched from the edges with lanterns swinging like watchful eyes. Elias wrote of the forced gaiety, the songs sung louder to drown out exhaustion, the children coaxed into dances while parents calculated risks in silence. But beneath the surface entries lay sharper truths, coded references to the true feast held far from the quarters, to signals passed in hummed melodies, to paths marked by notched branches leading west toward the river. He described the master's calculated generosity, how the brief loosening of chains during Yuletide bred just enough hope to tempt the desperate, how patrols doubled under the guise of holiday vigilance, how some who slipped away on Christmas night were never seen again. The journal's later pages grew fragmentary, stained with what might have been blood or rainwater, the final entry breaking off mid-sentence, "If the moon is veiled tonight," with the rest dissolved into an illegible smear. Eleanor closed the book gently, her hands numb from more than cold. The whispers had quieted while she read, as though listening, waiting for her to absorb the weight of Elias's words. When she rose, cradling the journal against her chest, the fog seemed to part slightly ahead, revealing a faint trail that had not been there moments before, winding deeper between the ancient trees where the ground sloped toward unseen hollows. Night had fully claimed the woods now, the fog glowing faintly where Eleanor's flashlight pierced it, turning every trunk into a sentinel draped in silver gray. The journal rested heavy in her coat pocket, its warped pages seeming to pulse with the rhythm of her steps as she followed the newly revealed trail downward into a shallow ravine. The air grew colder here, carrying the damp breath of hidden springs, and the ground softened underfoot, sucking gently at her boots as if reluctant to let her pass. The whispers, which had fallen silent while she read Elias's words, returned with renewed clarity, no longer fragmented but woven into distinct threads that braided and unbraided in the darkness. They rose from all sides now, intimate and immediate, as though spoken by bodies pressed close in the underbrush. A woman's voice, low and steady, recounted the gathering places, beyond the charcoal burn, where the three pines lean together, bring only what the hand can hide. Another, younger, trembled with restrained excitement. "Mama says the fiddler will play extra loud tonight so the dogs won't hear us slip away." A man's deeper murmur cut through, cautionary and weary. "Mind the new patrol from Albemarle, Master promised them bounty if they bring back runaways before Epiphany." Eleanor slowed, her breath clouding in the beam of light. The voices painted vivid scenes of those clandestine Christmas gatherings deep in the woods, far enough from Mulberry Row that the lanterns of overseers flickered only as distant stars. Families who seldom saw one another during the grinding weeks of harvest or nailery work stole hours here, sharing cornbread laced with precious molasses, passing a jug of cider bartered from the great house kitchen. Children, muffled in rags against the cold, listened wide-eyed to stories of Africa or of free black communities rumored beyond the Ohio River. Songs rose softly, spirituals whose coded verses spoke not of heavenly deliverance alone but of northern stars and safe houses marked by quilt patterns hung on lines. Yet threaded through the remembered joy ran undercurrents of dread. The voices overlapped in urgent warnings, patrols circling wider each year, dogs trained to ignore the scent of holiday ham carried as deliberate distraction, the cruel calculus that a few extra rations and one permitted dance made the enslaved believe, for a fleeting moment, that escape might be possible under cover of celebration. Elias's own timbre seemed to join the chorus now, recounting how hope was the sharpest chain, how the master's calculated mercy turned Yuletide into the season when the most desperate dared the woods, only to find snares waiting in the darkness. The trail dipped into a small clearing ringed by ancient cedars, their branches interlaced overhead like a natural cathedral. Here the voices swelled into a hushed chorus, harmonious yet sorrowful, evoking bodies long returned to earth yet unable to rest. Eleanor stood motionless at the edge, flashlight lowered, as the mist swirled thicker around her ankles and the words washed over her in waves of stolen laughter, stifled grief, and the defiant pulse of lives that refused complete erasure even as the plantation's polished history sought to silence them. The clearing lay hushed beneath the interlaced cedars, the voices fading into a reverent silence as Eleanor lingered at its edge, the journal a cold weight against her ribs. Snow had begun to fall, fat flakes drifting through the canopy like ash from a dying fire, settling on her shoulders and melting into the wool of her coat. She swept the flashlight in a slow arc, searching for any sign of the gatherings Elias had described. No remnants of old fires, no scattered bones of feasts long past, yet the ground appeared undisturbed, as though the earth had swallowed every trace. Then the beam caught movement at the far side of the clearing, a subtle shift in the mist, a darkening that coalesced into the outline of a human figure standing motionless beneath the lowest branches. Eleanor's breath lodged in her throat. The shape was tall, broad-shouldered, clad in rough garments that seemed woven from shadow itself, the edges fraying into the fog. No face was visible at first, only the suggestion of a bowed head and arms hanging loose at the sides, hands open as if in supplication or warning. She took an involuntary step back, the snow crunching beneath her boot with a sound that cracked the stillness like a musket shot. The figure did not flinch. Instead, it lifted its head slowly, and the flashlight's glow caught on features that emerged from the gloom: high cheekbones sharpened by hardship, eyes sunken yet luminous, skin dark as polished mahogany. The clothing resolved into period detail, a coarse Osnaburg shirt torn at the sleeves, heavy brogans laced with rawhide, a wool cap pulled low. Around the neck hung a forged iron collar, its hinge rusted but unmistakable, the kind used on those deemed flight risks. Recognition struck Eleanor like cold water. The man matched Elias's sparse self-description in the journal's margins: a sketch of strong hands scarred from the forge, a jagged mark across the left cheek from a youthful accident with molten metal. But more than that, he bore the likeness of the blacksmith whose disappearance had haunted the plantation ledgers. Vanished on a Christmas night years after the journal's final entry, his name crossed through with a single decisive stroke. The apparition regarded her without haste, sorrow etched deep in every line of its translucent form. Snow passed through him as though he were mist himself, yet he cast no footprint in the fresh layer upon the ground. A faint sound emanated from him, not speech, but the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, distant and mournful, echoing the labor that had defined his days. He raised one hand, palm outward, and pointed toward a thicket beyond the clearing where the cedars grew denser, their trunks twisted into unnatural spirals. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, fear and compulsion warring within her. The figure's mouth moved soundlessly, forming words she felt more than heard: see what they hid. The iron collar gleamed dully as he turned, beginning to walk toward the deeper woods, his form growing fainter with each step yet leaving a trail of disturbed snow that glowed faintly in her light, urging her to follow into the place where the living seldom tread and the dead still waited to bear witness. The spectral figure of Elias glided ahead, his form flickering like a candle flame in wind, the disturbed snow behind him glowing faintly as if lit from beneath the crust. Eleanor followed, her flashlight beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the thickening flakes, the woods closing ranks until the clearing vanished entirely. Branches scraped at her sleeves with increasing insistence, as though the forest sought to turn her back, yet the trail remained unnaturally clear, a straight, deliberate path where undergrowth should have choked every step. The ground sloped sharply now, descending into a ravine where the air grew still and heavier, the snow muffled to silence. Elias paused at the lip of the drop, turning to regard her with those luminous, sorrow-weighted eyes before dissolving downward into the darkness below. Eleanor hesitated only a moment, then descended after him, boots sliding on loose shale until she reached the bottom where ancient hemlocks formed a dense canopy that blotted out even the suggestion of sky. Here the woods revealed their hidden architecture. Her light swept across subtle anomalies: a low mound of earth braced by weathered stones, too regular to be natural, a fallen log split lengthwise and hollowed, its interior blackened by long-extinguished fires, narrow trenches half-filled with decades of leaf mold, aligned in patterns that suggested deliberate excavation. As she moved deeper, the signs grew bolder: iron spikes driven into trunks at intervals, rusted chains dangling like withered vines, their links thick enough to restrain a man. These were not random relics but components of a cruel network laid beneath the guise of holiday leniency. Elias reappeared ahead, gesturing toward a thicket where roots had been cunningly arranged to conceal an opening barely wide enough for a body. Kneeling, Eleanor brushed away snow and debris, exposing a tunnel shored with charred timbers, part of the underground passages the enslaved had dug in secret, linking distant clearings to the river beyond. But closer inspection revealed the traps woven into hope itself: pits lined with sharpened stakes now rotted to points, tripwires once connected to bells or guns, false trails branching into dead ends designed to exhaust and betray. The first rumble of thunder rolled across the ravine like distant artillery, low and ominous, shaking loose snow from the hemlock boughs overhead. Eleanor had barely begun to trace the rusted chains with her gloved fingers when the wind shifted, driving the flakes sideways in sudden, stinging gusts. The temperature plummeted as if a door had opened onto deeper winter, and the fog that had lingered all evening condensed into a hard, driving sleet that rattled against the leaves like buckshot. Within moments the storm was upon her, fierce and unnatural in its timing, blotting out the faint glow of Elias's spectral trail and turning the narrow ravine into a churning white void. She tried to retreat the way she had come, but the path had vanished beneath a fresh veil of snow, the ground now treacherous with hidden roots and slick shale. Lightning forked overhead, illuminating the twisted trunks in stark, fleeting flashes that revealed glimpses of the traps she had only begun to uncover, pits yawning wider in the strobing light, stakes glinting like teeth. Thunder followed instantly, deafening, as though the sky itself sought to drown out the whispers that had guided her this far. The voices returned then, no longer distant but immediate, rising in a frantic chorus that seemed to swirl within the storm itself. They spoke over one another now, urgency stripping away the measured cadence of memory. A woman's voice, sharp with fear. "He promised us the pass, said the master would look away till 12th night." A younger man, bitter, "sold us for a new coat and a bottle, told the overseer where we'd cross the creek." Another, older, heavy with resignation, "took 3 that year, left the rest to find the bodies come spring, lesson for the quarters." The words overlapped in waves of accusation and grief, naming a betrayer from within their own ranks, an enslaved driver granted small privileges who had traded secrets for favor, whispering routes and signals to the patrols in exchange for promises of better rations or leniency that, in the end, never materialized. Rain mixed with the sleet now, turning the ravine floor into a shallow, rushing stream that tugged at her boots and threatened to sweep her downhill toward the deeper traps. Eleanor pressed her back against a hemlock trunk, journal clutched tight inside her coat, as lightning revealed Elias once more, standing midway up the opposite slope, arm outstretched not in guidance but in warning, his mouth forming silent words lost to the howling wind. The chorus swelled louder, recounting the Christmas night when hope had turned lethal, families lured by the illusion of loosened vigilance, led along false paths to waiting snares, their cries swallowed by the same storm that raged now. The voices braided into a single, keening lament that vibrated through the trees, through the frozen ground, through her bones, carrying the weight of betrayals small and devastating that had ensured the plantation's order endured even during its season of pretended mercy. The storm raged unchecked, wind screaming through the ravine like a living thing, whipping sleet into Eleanor's face until her cheeks burned and her eyes streamed. She stumbled forward, one arm shielding her face, the other clutching the sodden journal as she fought to keep Elias's faint luminescence in sight. Lightning cracked again, closer now, turning the world to stark white and shadow, and in that brief illumination she saw him pointing not upward but downward, toward a low rise where snow had piled against a cluster of river stones arranged in an unnatural mound. Driven by instinct more than reason, she dropped to her knees in the frozen mud and began scraping away the fresh accumulation with gloved hands that had long since lost feeling. The earth beneath was softer than expected, yielding almost willingly, as though it had waited centuries for someone to disturb its rest. Her fingers struck wood rough-hewn planks rotted soft at the edges, then something smoother, a small wooden cross, no taller than her forearm, its arms crudely notched and bound with rusted wire. Snow filled the shallow grooves where letters had once been carved, but she brushed it clear to reveal faint initials, E.W. Beneath the cross, wrapped in fragments of oilcloth that disintegrated like ash, lay relics that stopped her breath. A forged iron key, heavy and cold, its bow shaped into a distinctive loop she recognized from Monticello's inventory sketches, the key to the great house cellar where holiday provisions were stored. Beside it, a tarnished silver thimble engraved with Jefferson's intertwined initials, the sort given as rare favors to skilled seamstresses in the household. A child's rag doll, its cornshuck face blackened by time, one button eye missing. And finally, most damning, a folded scrap of fine linen stationery, its edges scorched but the handwriting unmistakable, a fragment of Jefferson's own memorandum listing extra rations for the people during Christmas week, the ink faded but the calculated generosity preserved in elegant script. These were not random losses but deliberate burials, tokens carried by those who had dared the woods seeking freedom, tokens that linked the vanished directly to the heart of the plantation's power. The cross marked no Christian grave in the approved burying ground near the quarters but a hidden one, placed far from sanctified soil to ensure the dead could trouble neither master nor memory. Elias hovered nearby throughout her discovery, his form growing more substantial in the lightning's glare, sorrow deepening the lines around his translucent eyes as though witnessing the unearthing pained him anew. Rain pounded harder, turning the mound to slurry that threatened to wash away her findings, but Eleanor gathered the relics carefully into her coat, the weight of them anchoring her against the gale. The voices, which had quieted during her digging, stirred again in low, anguished harmony, threading through the storm to name others. The storm's fury began to ebb as abruptly as it had risen, the wind dropping to a mournful whisper and the sleet thinning to scattered flakes that drifted like ash through the ravaged trees. Eleanor crouched over the unearthed grave, relics clutched in her frozen hands, the crude cross trembling between her fingers as Elias's form hovered at the edge of her vision, his luminous eyes fixed not on her but on something emerging from the tree line behind. Footsteps crunched deliberately through the fresh snow, heavy, unhurried, belonging to flesh rather than phantom. She rose slowly, heart pounding anew, and turned to face a man in his late 60s, tall and raw-boned, dressed in weathered Carhartt and a wool watch cap pulled low. A high-powered flashlight dangled from one gloved hand, its beam sweeping the ravaged mound and the scattered relics with deliberate calm. His face, weathered by decades under Virginia sun, bore the angular lines of old Albemarle stock, and in the storm's aftermath his breath plumed steady and controlled. He did not speak at first, only studied her with pale eyes that held neither surprise nor warmth. Eleanor recognized the surname before he offered it, descended from the overseer who had patrolled these same woods 2 centuries earlier, the one whose ledgers recorded bounties collected and runaways returned in chains. Local records still listed the family on parcels bordering the historic site, quiet custodians of land that had never fully changed hands. He carried no weapon openly, yet the way he held the light suggested long familiarity with night walks through these hollows. "You shouldn't be digging here," he said at last, voice low and even, carrying the soft drawl of the Piedmont. "Some things stay buried for good reason." The relics weighed heavier in her coat as understanding settled cold in her gut. This was no chance encounter, the storm's timing, the path that had opened so conveniently, even the voices that had quieted the man's flashlight beam held steady on Eleanor's face, pinning her in place as melting snow dripped from the hemlocks overhead and pooled in the churned earth around the open grave. He took one deliberate step closer, boots sinking deep, his expression unreadable save for a flicker of something old and guarded in his eyes. Elias's form wavered at the periphery, brighter now, as though drawing strength from the confrontation unfolding in the ravine. The relics in Eleanor's coat seemed to burn against her chest, their silent testimony suddenly louder than the fading wind. Then the voices rose once more, no longer scattered whispers but a unified tide that poured through the trees and wrapped around the living intruder like binding cords. They spoke in overlapping layers, women and men and children whose names had been reduced to ledger entries, recounting the calculated cruelty that had turned Christmas respite into a lethal snare. A clear, resonant voice, Elias's own, emerged above the rest, steady and unflinching. "The passes were given so we would run. The extra meat, the music, the day without the whip, all to make us believe the watch was loosened." Another joined, fierce with long-suppressed rage. Patrols waited along every known trail, dogs held back until the signal. Hope was the bait, and the woods the trap. The chorus swelled, detailing the mechanism of despair, how overseers mapped secret gathering spots from careless words overheard during forced merriment, how trusted drivers were promised manumission papers that never materialized if they revealed planned escapes, how the master's own memoranda, preserved in elegant hand, recorded the return of runaways or their convenient disappearance with the same detachment as crop yields. They named the years when the most vanished: 1808, 1816, 1822, always during the 12 nights when bondage briefly pretended to relax its grip. Children's voices threaded through, recounting hiding in hollow logs while parents led patrols away, only to walk into pits or snares set days earlier under the guise of holiday woodcutting. The man shifted uncomfortably, his beam wavering for the first time as the voices pressed closer, circling him with the weight of unpaid debts. Snowflakes passed through Elias's outstretched arm as he pointed directly at the descendant, mouth moving in silent judgment. The chorus crescendoed into a single, indelible truth. The celebrations were never gifts but weapons, engineered to identify the restless, to cull the bold, to teach the quarters that even the season of supposed goodwill offered no sanctuary. Hope, deliberately kindled and just as deliberately crushed, kept the system intact long after the fiddler's last note faded and the great house windows went dark. Eleanor stood transfixed between the living guardian of silence and the dead who refused it any longer, the voices weaving around her like chains breaking in slow, inexorable motion, their echoes rising through the ravaged trees to ensnare anyone who dared believe the past could remain comfortably buried beneath polished narratives and seasonal cheer.